Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to the East Baton Rouge Parish Library. My name is Melissa Easton. I'm head of special collections. See a lot of new faces in here. So for those of you who don't know what special collections is, we're located on the second floor of the main library here just outside of Reference. We are the Baton Rouge Room Archives as well as the genealogy department. We collect all kinds of goodies from Baton Rouge's history, uh, political, physical, social. We've got a wonderful display up there right now that looks at Baton Rouge staycation, lots of fun historic maps, guidebooks, and little tchotchkes, things that you would find at the state capitol. So if you have time or next time you're in the library, go ahead and take a visit upstairs. It's my favorite part of the library. We do this lecture series on the third Wednesday of every month. Next month, we will be having Hans Rasmussen from LSU Special Collections to talk about their Louisiana newspaper project. It's an amazing project. They've been collecting historical newspapers from Louisiana and then digitizing them, making them available on microfilm, should you prefer, or at home on your personal computer. It's a wonderful project, so we're very excited. We are also very excited tonight to have Tim Nessmith from the USS Kidd. I'm sure all of you know about Tim, but at home, he has been the ship superintendent and educational outreach coordinator for the USS Kidd Veterans Museum and Historical Landmark for 7 years. Before taking this position, he worked in numerous aspects of the museum, including tour guide, as well as overseeing the very popular overnight camping educational program, and he has been with the museum since 1995. So please give him a warm welcome. Tim?
Thank you very much. And the microphone is working. I want to thank you all for the opportunity to come here and talk about the Kidd. Anytime I get to talk about the USS Kidd, it's a great day for me because I think it's probably maybe not the happiest place on earth. That's obviously Disneyland, but to me, it's one of the most awesome places on earth. So let's get started. This presentation is not only brought to you by the USS Kidd, but it's brought to you by my dogs, Shifu, Sweet Pea, and Zola, and my wife, Michelle, because when I put this stuff together, I ignore them for a few hours and I have to pay for it later. So, let's start with the history of the USS Kidd. What's in a name? The ship is a destroyer, and the U.S. Navy names destroyers after heroes of the Navy, heroes of the Marine Corps, or civilians who have contributed significantly to the Navy or the Marine Corps. So USS Kidd is named after Rear Admiral Isaac Campbell Kidd Sr. And Admiral Kidd was a native of Cleveland, Ohio, went to the Naval Academy. If I remember correctly, he graduated 1906. One of his first assignments was with the Great White Fleet, with their Round the World cruise. You might be familiar with Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet. He was later executive officer of the USS Utah and then commanding officer of the USS Arizona. And of course, he had assignments in between there before eventually becoming commander of Battleship Division 1. And Arizona was in Battleship Division 1. So he flew his flag, as they say. He was commanding the entire division from the Arizona. Didn't mean he was still captain of the Arizona. That's somebody else's job at this point. He's commanding more ships. An admiral always commands multiple ships. A captain commands one ship, which if you're a Star Trek fan, as Ed is here in the audience, that's one thing Captain Kirk always hated. He hated being an admiral. He wanted one ship, and that was the Enterprise. So Admiral Kidd is in charge of multiple ships now in Battleship Division 1, and that's his role when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And he was on the bridge directing anti-aircraft fire when the bomb that hit the forward magazine of the Arizona detonated, and he was killed in that action and awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, along with the Purple Heart. I got to talk very briefly with his son, Isaac Kidd Jr., who was also an admiral, a higher ranking admiral later on. At this point in time when the admiral was killed, Ike Jr. Was about 10 days away from graduating from the Naval Academy. So he discovered that his father had been killed right before he graduates. They graduated his class early, and then he went straight out to war. Was assigned to the USS Putnam as a gunnery officer, and fought in the European theater before eventually moving to the Pacific with the Putnam. But Ike, as he called himself, he said Dad hated the name Isaac. He never went by Isaac. He always went by the nickname Cap, after Captain Kidd the pirate. His classmates decided to call him that, and it was a little play on words. Oh, you're going to be a big shot one day. You're going to be a captain. Sure you are. Sure you are. So if you were a good friend of Admiral Kidd Sr., then you called him by his nickname Cap. If you didn't know him that well, you were a subordinate or somebody else not affiliated with the family or a close friend, you called him by his rank. You called him lieutenant or captain or ensign, whatever he was at that point in time. But Admiral Kidd Jr. told me, he said, we had a short phone conversation, and I mentioned how survivors of the Arizona get to have their ashes brought back to the ship and buried with those that were entombed on the battleship in Pearl Harbor. And I asked him, I said, so your father's entombed on the Arizona? He said, no, not really. He said, in the aftermath of the battle, they went on board to inspect the wreck, and they found Dad's class ring from the academy, and it had been welded, fused by the heat right up against the bulkhead of the ship on the bridge. And they chiseled that off and they brought it back home to the family, and the family took it to Tiffany's and refashioned the ring and recast it as a Naval Academy ring. And that heirloom has passed on to each of the successive Isaac Kidds since then. It passed on to Ike and then on down the line. They're on Isaac Kidd the fifth now. And what's interesting is Isaac Jr. called himself Ike. He didn't use the name Isaac. He's like, son, do you know President Eisenhower? Yes, sir. I like Ike? Yes, sir. He said, I liked Ike, so I used Ike. And his son, in honor of his grandfather, used the nickname Cappy after Cap. And then apparently Isaac the fourth went by the middle name Campbell, and only Isaac the fifth, who I think is 17 now, Isaac the fifth has decided he likes the name Isaac. So he's the first one out of 5 of them to actually use the name Isaac. But Ike Jr. said that when they found the ring, they realized there was no body there. There were no remains. The explosion was so hot that it just incinerated his father. There was nothing left. So that's the story of Isaac Campbell Kidd Sr. and the USS Arizona. 3 destroyers has been named after him, and 1 training base in, anybody been to San Diego? Balboa Park. They had a training base during World War II named in his honor. So USS Kidd, docked in Baton Rouge, is the first of 3 that was named for this gentleman. You can see her there on the Baton Rouge riverfront. She arrived in Baton Rouge in 1982 and opened to the public in 1983. The museum building that we have, if you've been able to tour us, opened up in 1986, and they started building exhibits and holding programming in there. And it's a non-funded state agency, which our chairman of the board is here with us today, Mr. Bob Hawthorne, and he will tell you that gets people confused quite a bit. Are you a nonprofit agency, or does the government fund you? We are a nonprofit agency. We are a state agency, but the state doesn't give us a dime. So we have to go out and fundraise from private sources to pay for the paint, to pay for the flags, to pay for the rope, the canvas, whatever. And it gets a little confusing. Now, a little bit of history. The kid, uh-oh, did I lose it? Huh? I'm back? Okay. So the kid is DD 661. Now, DD means that she is a destroyer. If you go through naval terminology, BB means a battleship, CV means a carrier, CA or CL means it's a type of cruiser, DD is the destroyer. Submarines back in World War II were SS. Now they're SSBNs, SS ends, and so forth and so on. It just gets confusing the deeper down the rabbit hole you go. But she is DD-661. I'm going to reference Star Trek again. I'm a big sci-fi fan. If you're familiar with Star Trek, you know the USS Enterprise is NCC-1701. Gene Roddenberry was a military officer, and he knew naval nomenclature, and NCC literally stands for Naval Construction Contract 1701. So looking at this, Kidd is the 661st destroyer contracted to be built, not necessarily built because they canceled some of them, but the 661st contracted to be built by the U.S. Navy. Now you see up on the screen the Pirate of the Pacific. When they were building Kidd at Kearney, New Jersey, in Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock in Kearney, New Jersey, they launched her, sent her across the harbor to New York, to Brooklyn Naval Shipyard. And when they did, the first crew that's coming on board is looking for a mascot. Most of these ships had a mascot. And they looked around and they said, you know, back in the day in New York Harbor and all along Boston and Massachusetts and everything, there was this guy that sailed around before he went back to England. His name was William Kidd. He became the pirate, allegedly, William Kidd, and became famous as a so-called pirate. And they ended up hanging him in 1701. It's the same name, same spelling. What if we called ourselves the Pirates of the Pacific? And they kind of spread it around the crew a little bit, and the crew was like, yeah, we like it. So they went to Mrs. Kidd, Inez Kidd, the admiral's widow, and they said, ma'am, we would like to paint a pirate up on the smokestack. And we would like to call ourselves the Pirates of the Pacific. They knew at this point they were going to be going to the Pacific, not the Atlantic. And they said, we don't want to be disrespectful to the admiral's memory. So how do you feel about that, ma'am? And Miss Inez said, that would be great, because Isaac hated his first name. He went by Captain Kidd. So she went to the admirals running the Navy, most of them who were contemporaries and friends and classmates of Admiral Kidd, and she said, she did the finger thing, according to Ike Jr. He said she was wagging that finger like that she was their mother. I want these boys to paint a pirate up on the smokestack. Now, if you're familiar with World War II at all, you've watched the History Channel at all, you've seen all these big bombers, and they've got, or fighter planes, and they've got tiger shark teeth. They've got cute girls pinned up, you know, on the cockpit, on the fuselage. You know, it's nose art, they call it. Stack art on ships was just as common. Some of our stack art for our squadron from World War II, you had an 8-ball up on the USS Black, DD-666. You had a bull up on USS Bullard, snorting with fighter planes running around them. All sorts of things. So stack art was nothing new, and the admirals were like, yes, ma'am, whatever you want. She took it a step further. She said, I want these boys to also fly a skull and crossbones. And that's when you hear the little record scratch, you hear the brakes screeching, and everybody just pauses and freezes. And they start talking amongst themselves, and you know, it's like, wait a minute, it's a Navy ship. Navy ships hunt pirates. You know, in World War II, you could still get hung in some places in the world if you were caught being a pirate. So this was a little unorthodox, but then somebody pointed out, according to Admiral Kidd Jr., somebody pointed out, said, you know, she's a widow. Are you really going to tell a widow no? And at that point, everybody just snapped to him and was like, yes, ma'am, whatever you want. And so Kidd, supposedly, this kid, has written permission. We're looking for the document. I got a couple of friends at National Archives that are looking for the paper that says that she has official written permission to fly the Skull and Crossbones, the only U.S. Navy ship to be able to do that from 1776 to that point in time. Now, other ships have done it, but supposedly they didn't have written permission. But we're looking for that paperwork. Hopefully we'll be able to find it soon. COVID has kind of stalled everything at the National Archives and the Library of Congress. So, Kidd fits out in Brooklyn. She does some duty in the Atlantic, not necessarily the Atlantic crossings going over to England, like you see in the movie Greyhound, which we'll touch on in a little bit. But she did some patrol duty off of Newfoundland area. She did convoy duty, escorting military ships, carriers, battleships coming out of Norfolk and the shipyards on the East Coast, taking them down to Trinidad. And eventually they form up a task force, if you're familiar with USS Alabama over in Mobile. And she was one of the ones that they formed up with, and they went through the Panama Canal and headed toward Pearl Harbor. One of her early actions is a bombardment at Wake Island. Then she gets down in the deep South Pacific around the Marianas, around the Marshalls, Solomon Islands, and she begins to see action. Her job as a destroyer is to be a bodyguard. So what she's doing is she's screening, she's protecting, being a bodyguard for the aircraft carriers and the largest ships of the task force. As an aircraft carrier, not an aircraft carrier, as a bodyguard for the aircraft carrier, not only are you supposed to take a torpedo if a Japanese plane drops a torpedo on a carrier or a battleship, you're supposed to get in the way and take that hit because they can build a destroyer in 3 or 4 or 5 months' time. It takes years to build a battleship, years to build a carrier, a couple of years. So you're expendable, like the John Wayne movie, they were expendable. Destroyers are expendable. So not only are they doing that, but they're trailing behind sometimes. They're designated to trail behind the carrier. And when planes take off and develop problems, Nate Bergeron can talk about that. He's a pilot. When they develop problems, sometimes they have to ditch. In fact, we have multiple stories of a couple of planes coming off the USS Essex and immediately ditching. Something went wrong, and they're in the water and they're treading water and they're waiting for the carrier to stop. And the carriers are like modern day oil tankers, super tankers. It takes 18 miles for a super tanker to come to a complete stop just from the inertia. But with the carriers, you don't want them to stop because when they stop, they're stationary and they're a perfect target for a submarine to put a torpedo into. So the carriers are always in motion until they come into harbor. So the destroyers are small, they're fast, they're agile and nimble. So they're trailing behind. They get word, pick up these guys. So they go over and they drop the nets and they pick these guys up. And those guys live on the destroyer for a few days until they can transfer them over safely. Usually via a high line, they'll take a little line throwing gun, shoot it across the bow of the other ship, and then pull a system of ropes across and set up a little breeches buoy, they call it, or a sling, and those guys will sit, and then they'll just pull them by pulley between the ships. And of course, the ships are up and down and coming together and they're going apart. 9 times out of 10, they dunked them. And the destroyers would take and get ice cream as a reward for the crew for rescuing their downed aviators. So Kidd did that quite a bit in the South Pacific. By the time you get to 1944, she's shot down numerous planes attacking the carriers and the battleships. She's dropped a lot of depth charges, but we never got a confirmed submarine kill. Our first confirmed submarine kill was in Greyhound. We finally got one. So did I knock it out again? No, I'm good? Okay. I get excited by submarine kills. So by the time you get to the Philippines and the invasion of the Philippines, MacArthur returning to the Philippines, Kidd has helped escort troop ships to the invasion of Leyte. And a lot of people are very familiar, especially after this past April 1st, with the rediscovery of the hull, the wreck of the USS Johnston from the Battle off Samar. It's a real David and Goliath story. If you're not familiar with the Battle off Samar, you really need to look it up. It's just fabulous. It's a moment where the U.S. Navy really shines, particularly destroyers. Five destroyers and destroyer escorts facing off against 20 Japanese destroyers. I forget how many cruisers and the 2 largest battleships ever built on the planet. And they fought so tenaciously, they scared them off. And the Japanese admiral thought he was walking into a trap, and he turned his whole fleet around and left at the cost of 2 destroyers and 1 destroyer escort. Fabulous story. Hopefully it gets put into a movie sometime soon. Kidd, fortunately for us, for Nathan and I having a job, I guess, Kidd wasn't there at that point. She had already pulled out and left escorting her empty troop ships back to Majuro to go pick up more troops to continue the invasion. So Kidd and her squadron had already left the area a couple of days before that immense battle. Otherwise, she might be at the bottom of the Pacific, of the Philippine Trench now. December of 44, she's headed home. She also missed Halsey's Typhoon Cobra, if you're familiar with that. A lot of ships sunk. One of them was a Fletcher-class destroyer, just like Kidd. Two of them were two older destroyers. One gentleman, in fact, from one of those old destroyers who was from Beauregard Parish, from De Ritter. He did not make it off the ship. She goes back to San Francisco, to Hunters Point. And I'm sorry, not Hunters Point, Mare Island, and gets a refit. This brand new technology. She has seen. She's like a horse that's been ridden hard and put up wet. She needs some tender, loving care. And all of her squadron went back and got some TLC. She comes out in January. She heads back out to the Pacific, gets to Pearl, and from Pearl they head straight to Ulithi Atoll, which is a forward base. And from Ulithi they head to Okinawa. And at Okinawa, this being the last stop on the march to Japan, on the island hopping campaign going to Japan. This is the last stop. They're within range of Japanese planes flying out of the Japanese islands, which means the carriers, the battleships, the troop ships, they're all vulnerable. And what they ended up doing, they took and drew essentially a line on the map between Japan and between Okinawa, and they took destroyers. Remember, they're expendable. That's the key to remember about destroyers. You can build a bunch of them faster than you can build a carrier or a battleship. So they took these expendable little destroyers and put it on this radar picket line, so that as they're sitting here on the line, that they can see on the radar Japan and their airspace, and they can see Okinawa and the fleet. And of course, not visible. And anytime aircraft launch from Japan, they get on the radio, they call the carriers at Okinawa, the carriers launch the planes, and the planes come up and they meet above where the destroyers are. So not only do you have planes fighting planes, but you have the ships providing anti-aircraft fire to stop anybody from getting through. Now, the Japanese weren't stupid. The Japanese knew. They see what's going on. They see their planes disappearing at these spots, and hey, these little ships are out here. They're seeing us on this brand new thing called radar. We have to knock out those ships. So Kidd and the other destroyers now become targets of opportunity. And the Japanese begin targeting them, because if they start taking out enough destroyers, they'll knock big enough holes where they can slip through that radar coverage, get to Okinawa, and take out those troop ships, stall the invasion. On April 11th, 1945, Kidd is sailing approximately 90 miles east of Okinawa-jima, and her division, Des Dive 96, her USS Black, USS Chauncey, and USS Bullard are sailing along. And if you're standing on the Kidd, I'll do this for the folks here, folks out in Facebook land, if you're familiar with downtown Baton Rouge. If you're standing on the Kidd, then right about where the AFB's TV tower is on shore would be about the distance in the direction that USS Black would be. If you look forward of the Kidd, right about where the Chase building is, and these are all approximate. I haven't taken a tape measure. Right about where the Chase building is, that would be where the USS Bullard was, and then Chauncey would have been in the river directly forward of Kidd, same distance as the Chase building. They're sailing in a box formation. They've been attacked 3 times already. Once at dawn, once mid-morning, once at noon. At 1:55 in the afternoon, they have a plane come in from port side. Port is your left. P-O-R-T, 4 letters. L-E-F-T, 4 letters. Easy way to remember. Comes in from the left, crosses in front of the formation to take out Bullard. Chauncey takes the plane out. Kidd was backing her up in case something went wrong, and her Mark 37 gun director, which sits all the way up on top of the ship. And let's see, I can show it to you. Photograph. Go back. If you look in front of the mast, you see a little box sitting all the way at the top of the ship above those 2 5-inch guns on the front. That is the Mark 37 gun director, and it can control all 5 5-inch guns. That's the biggest guns on the ship. All 5 of them together, and fire salvos with them. And then if they get too many targets, they can turn them into local control, and each gun mount goes into what I call a zone defense, just like football. You're going to cover a certain area. So it runs away in train. It's damaged. They're going to have to repair a couple of anodes that have melted together to make a continuous circuit to make it run away and train. So it's out of commission. They're cranking it around by hand, and that thing weighs, Mason, about 35 tons, 25 tons? Several tons. Not something I want to crank by hand. We've done it, and it's not fun. It's time consuming. And when you have a plane bearing down on you, it's really time consuming. So as our guys are taking and cranking it back into position, at the same time, off to the starboard side, about where WFB's television tower is, nowadays, they see two planes dogfighting. Now, if you're not familiar with what dogfighting is, I say this sometimes, and unfortunately, the little kids that come on tour are like, Michael Vick? Not Michael Vick. This is when two planes are trying to take each other out. So two planes are dogfighting on the starboard outboard side of Black, and they get close to Black, and one of them attacks. Black takes it out, and while it's busy with the first plane near the front of the ship, the other plane, which had curved off to the side as if he's clearing a field of fire, because they're thinking one's American or Allied, one's Japanese. The one they thought was Allied actually curves back in and attacks the back end of the Black. It's a trick. Two planes pretending to fight, just missing each other with their gunfire to get close to the ships instead of being shot down 10 miles away by those big 5-inch guns. He comes in, he attacks the Black, they shoot at him, they hit him in the wing, but at the last minute, he leapfrogs up and over and comes down on the other side of the Black, headed toward Kidd. Now, a crossfire is usually bad because if Ed is shooting at me and somebody's back here and I'm busy with Ed, they can shoot me in the back and I can't help myself. But in this instance, it worked for the Japanese plane because the two ships, if they miss, hit each other. I got to stop doing that. I'm sorry. So he's coming in and attacking. They're only open fire with their smaller anti-aircraft guns, smaller caliber. That way they won't sink each other. And he gets hit in the other wing. He's burning. He levels out and he plows into the body of the ship right at the forward smokestack, which puts him in the forward fire room. And it's important to note that the hull of the ship is only 3/8 of an inch thick. Battleships have about a foot of steel. Carriers have about a foot of steel on the side, and then they've also got these big hollow torpedo blisters, where if a torpedo comes in, they hit that blister first. It sets it off before it actually comes into contact with the main hull. Destroyers just have 3/8 of an inch of thickness. Punches through that, hits the boiler, shears off one of the feed lines. Every man in there is killed instantly by 650 pounds per square inch steam, 600 pounds per square inch steam, 850 degrees. They're gone. The bomb breaks loose from the wreckage of the plane, punches through the rest of the compartment and all the equipment, comes out the other side, 3/8 of an inch, saved us there because if it had retained the bomb, it would have blown the ship apart. Goes out about 12 yards away from the ship and detonates. Now, every man was trained that if you're not on a gun shooting and you're not handing ammunition to a gun, then if you hear the 20 millimeter guns, the smallest guns on the ship, little machine guns, and not really little, they're as big as this camera tripod right here. If you hear those fire in one direction and you're not doing one of those two actions, you need to get to cover. Go in the opposite direction because something's going to hit the ship. Something's got past the big 5-inch guns, which fire 10 miles in range. Something's got past the 40 millimeter guns, which fire 6 miles in range. These smaller guns have become more and more obsolete as the war has gone on because the planes are getting better armored. They're getting bigger and heavier. They're getting self-sealing tanks. They're going to get through. All the crew rushes to the port side that can in just the 10 seconds reaction time between it topping Black and it hitting Kidd. Not much time to react. They run right into the shrapnel from the bomb blast. They ran right into danger. Didn't know it was going to go through. Had no clue. Now, 38 men got killed. 55 were wounded. That's almost 1/3 of the 330-man crew on the Kidd. They got out of the area and got back to the forward base at Ulithi Atoll, buried their dead at sea along the way. If you saw Greyhound, then that burial at sea that they depicted is very similar, and it actually was on the exact location where our burial at sea took place off Phantom. The pilot, we determined later in around 2001 or so, we had a researcher come in and he was helping some museums in Japan try to identify all the kamikaze pilots that flew during the war. And through his research, he was about 98% certain that the pilot was Lieutenant Shigehisa Yaguchi, who by trade was an engineer before the war started. And then he volunteered, and he was age 23, flying a Mitsubishi Zero. Kidd got some temporary repairs at Ulithi, returned to the States, to Hunters Point Shipyard, and got repaired and was on her way back when the war ended. So she did not see any more action during World War II. She was mothballed between World War II and Korea, brought back out for Korea in 1951, and served through the Korean War, through the Cold War until 1964, when they retired her permanently and determined that she was obsolete. And in 1982, she comes to Baton Rouge, and we have restored her back to her World War II configuration. A lot of the ships were modernized. They changed their structures to handle bigger and heavier weaponry, more technology. And those ships that are still around, those destroyers that are still around that were converted like that, can't walk backwards to World War II. Kidd had stuff pulled off of her, but she never got structurally changed to handle this new stuff. And as a result, when they first got here, Nate was one of the early crew members that helped do the restoration. They were able to go out, find this old, antiquated World War II technology. Some of the 20 millimeter guns on board the ship came from a field behind a naval reserve center in Amsterdam. The Americans just left these old guns. They were obsolete. Just leave them. And a couple of Dutch naval attaches were in town. They were talking to our crew, and they said, "What do you need?" And we're like, "Well, we're looking for 20 millimeter guns." And they said, "Oh, what kind do you need? Singles, twins, quads? We got a field full of them." And a year, what was it, a year and a half later, another ship comes in, and they get a phone call and said, Dutch ship Zudicrus is going to be in town on so-and-so date. They've got your guns. And they just swing them over and drop them on the deck. Nathan installs them. Right before I came on in 95, they had sent out a blind letter to navies that had inherited Fletcher-class destroyers from us to rebuild their navies after World War II. And they sent out a blind letter with a list of stuff that they were looking for. And 94, early 95, they got a response from the Turkish embassy. Said, "You have a K gun, some arbors, and about 19 depth charges coming your way. And we're getting them to Portsmouth. You get them the rest of the way." So right as I was coming on board, they were getting these nasty old depth charges and cleaning them up and repainting them and everything. And the funny thing about it was they were, you hear about Turkish cabbies, the stereotype for crazy Turkish cabbies driving around. Well, these depth charges had the explosives taken out of them after they were no longer, of any use, and they filled them with concrete, and they put chains between them and ropes between them, and they were literally lane dividers in the streets of Istanbul, Turkey. So it's amazing what you'll find and what it's being used for nowadays. So that is the story of our USS Kidd. The story doesn't end there, because the name passed on. In the late 70s, early 80s, the Navy was building destroyers. I'm sorry, not the Navy. One of our shipyards was building, when was it? What's the Ingalls Shipyard in Pascagoula was building destroyers based off of our existing design from the Spruance class, and they were building them for the Shah of Iran. And they finished up 4 of them, and they were about to deliver them, and the revolution happened. And the Shah of Iran got deposed, and in comes the Ayatollah. And the Navy said, "Hold on, we're not going to give these 4 destroyers cutting-edge technology to a hostile nation." So they bought them from the shipyard. And because of that background, some of the sailors that served on those 4 nicknamed them the Ayatollah class. But that wasn't the official name. They looked around to see how they could name the ships. And somebody said, there were 4 admirals that were killed. in World War II. Let's name them after those admirals. So the first admiral that was killed was Admiral Kidd, and the first ship that was commissioned was DDG, Destroyer Guided Missile 993, and they named it Kidd, and thus the first ship of a new class carries that name onto the class. So it became the Kidd class guided missile destroyers. And of course, sailors being sailors, they nicknamed it also the Dead Admirals class. What are you going to do? 993 served from 1981 to 1998, and she is currently sailing for the Navy in Taiwan. She became obsolete, and they passed the name on again to DDG 100. This is an Arleigh Burke class destroyer. That's the main type of destroyer that's in the U.S. Navy right now. And as you can see from the right-hand picture, she's wearing that Jolly Roger, loud and proud. Kidd is possibly the only ship name where every ship that has borne the name could conceivably be floated side by side. Usually the name doesn't pass on until the predecessor has been cut up or has been sunk, but they've kind of stopped doing that now. The USS the Sullivans has two going along, but every ship so far in the Kidd class that has borne the Kidd name is still around. So that's a unusual tidbit of information for you. Now, for my background, I've been at the Kidd since 1995, but I wear another hat at the moment, and that is I am currently serving as the president of the Louisiana Association of Museums. And so I'm going to change hats for just a moment, and I'm going to put my lamb hat on, and I'm going to talk to you about museums. If you're not familiar with museums, I heard a great description about 2 years ago in Washington State, and the lady that was talking was with the American Alliance of Museums, and she said, museums have a double-edged sword. Everybody loves museums, but at the same time, museums come off as leeches because they always want you to give them money. Hey, join our membership program. Hey, sign up for this program over here. It just costs this much. And we're always fundraising to continue our mission because most of them don't get government subsidized funds. So she said they have this perception. And one of the ways that we fight this perception is to give you some interesting stats. Now, this goes back a couple of years. I think it was around 2015, if I'm remembering correctly. 850 million visits to museums nationwide annually. That's 850 heads walking through the doors in 1 year to every sort of museum. If it's a ship museum like Kidd, if it's a children's museum like here in Baton Rouge, the Knock Knock Museum, if it's an art museum, if it's an old car museum, it's a sports hall of fame, plantation home, anything like that. That's all grouped together. That outstrips by almost half every professional baseball, basketball, hockey, and football game combined, plus every theme park out there, counting Disney. We beat them all. Now, take that fact along with the fact that you have major league sports that do get government subsidization. Is that a word? Governments, they get subsidized by the government, fixing their arenas, fixing their parking lots, what have you, from the parish or county, from the city, or from the state. So right now, the New Orleans Saints Superdome gets subsidized by the state of Louisiana. USS Kidd doesn't get subsidized, but we're part of a group that gets more attendance than the New Orleans Saints and all the NFL. Who would have thought that? I never would have thought it, not until she called my museum a leech. Museums generate $50 billion into the U.S. economy each year. And like I said, most of them get almost no government, or if they do get government funding, a little bit of government funding. So every year in February, there is something called Museum Advocacy Day. It's 2 days, and museums descend upon Washington, D.C., and they go lobby the heck out of their congressmen and their senators. And what you can do everybody in this room and everybody out in internet land, keep an eye out every February for Museum Advocacy Day and write to your congressman, write to your senators, write to your president, write to your mayor, write to your governor and say, I believe in museums. Museums are important for my city, my state, my country, and I want you to support them. Because if we don't tell them, they're not going to think about it, and they're going to be looking at other stuff. So that's your homework going away from here. I used to be a teacher. I give homework. And now the thing that's on everybody's mind, the movies. Kidd has been involved with a ton of stuff, whether it's video games, whether it's television, whether it's movies. Her very first actress role was playing, are you ready for it? A Japanese destroyer in Run Silent, Run Deep in 1957. They're on the bottom. Now, 1941 and Tora Tora Tora, our P-40 fighter plane was in that, and also a little movie called Solitude Point that was filmed here in Baton Rouge in 1997, actually played at the old Essen Lane Theater. Kidd was in Sons of Guns, Modern Marvels, The Great Ships, NCIS New Orleans. Got to see Scott Bakula. He's pretty cool. And then the one everybody's been looking for lately, and the one I've been referencing, Greyhound in 2018. Now, Greyhound started talking to us in 2016, and so for 2 years before filming, we couldn't say anything. And then during filming, we couldn't even acknowledge, all the news cameras are on the levee, but we couldn't acknowledge that we were closed for filming. We were closed for routine maintenance because of the famous DBA, or DBA? Not DBA. NDA, non-disclosure agreement. So we couldn't acknowledge anything. And then for the 2 years after, until they released the film, we couldn't talk about it. So somebody, and I love it, came up, I had to include it, came up with this wonderful artwork from World War II, Loose Ships, Sink Ships. So this poster talked about somebody talked. And somebody, some genius out in the world, if you're out there on the internet watching, I love your artwork. Somebody tweeted. We literally had to tell everybody, keep your phones at home. Don't bring your cell phones. Don't take pictures. It was like super secret stuff, spy stuff. And what was funny was the film crew was taking pictures all over the place. I felt really like I didn't get to do anything. But we've had fun with it since then, because on social media, since the movie has come out, we've been just talking about Greyhound like crazy. Over on the right, when we had all these hurricanes last year coming through, we had a little fun talking about the fact that, or alluding to the fact that Tom Hanks plays in Greyhound and Tom Hanks was in Forrest Gump. So we have Lieutenant Dan make an appearance. Only 2 hurricanes? What are you talking about? We had a lot of fun with that. We also, during award season this year, took the Screen Actors Guild, we took the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, and we took the Academy Awards to task because they did not nominate a single nomination for USS Kidd or for HMCS Sackville, which is one of our sister ships in the historic fleet. She played Dickie in the movie. When you see one of the guys go get him, Dickie! That's actually a real ship. And they didn't nominate either of us for Best Actress or Best Supporting Actress. So we lambasted them on social media. We had fun with it. If you can't laugh, what's the point, right? So, since we do not get government funding, what do? Well, we have walk-in admissions, we have tours, we have overnight camping and rentals. We have gift shop sales. Everybody loves souvenirs. We don't have the little Mickey Mouse ears, but we do have kid baseball caps and pirate hats and sailor hats. And we take and apply for grants, and we ask for donations. So we have guided tours. We have had guided tours on board since 1983. And what's funny is one of our employees now, Mr. James Landry, he came aboard and spent the night on board ship. We do birthday parties as well. He spent the night aboard ship with our overnight camping program as a Cub Scout, one of the very first scouting groups ever to stay aboard ship. He remembered that so much that when he came to LSU as a college student, he walked down to the museum and he came in and he said, I want to work here. And he applied and he got a job and he gave tours. Well, he graduates school, he leaves, he gets a career in the oil industry, he moves around the country. Nate knows what I'm talking about. Nate went all over the world with his career. James comes back to town, in between jobs. Hey, I'm free. Can I come out and give overnights? He wants to do it again. So he works with us a little while, and then he heads back out to Norway or to somewhere in Africa, or the last one was China. And at some point, he comes back, and he's home in Abbeville for a while, and he takes over as scout leader his old Cub Scout pack, and he's running that. And he brings those kids out and spends the night aboard ship. And right now, he's back from China. He's home and resting a little bit and just kind of taking a breather between jobs, and he's coming out and doing overnights for us. So you have a generation and another generation just coming back. Kidd is in the fiber of the children and now the adults of South Louisiana. We have military ceremonies. If you are commissioning into the military, if you're re-enlisting, if you get a promotion, if you're retiring, you can do that on board the USS Kidd. So they come out and they do that, and that's another revenue source. At one point, we were in the top 10 in the 1980s and 90s, top 10 destinations for military reunions, World War II reunions, Vietnam reunions, you name it. And that translated into millions of dollars in the local economy through restaurants and through hotel stays during that time period. At one point, for 1 year, we were the #1 spot. Patriotic events, we do the anniversary of our kamikaze attack on April 11th. We help the city with their annual 4th of July celebration, and we observe Pearl Harbor Day for Admiral Kidd every year. How many of you have ever been to a living history event? They'll call them reenactors. We have a living history event annually on Labor Day weekend. We've got a group that comes out, and it's been growing year after year. The original group was with a Navy group out of Texas, and they were looking for a ship to call their own. And they have since branched out to the USS Lexington in Corpus Christi. They started on the USS Stewart in Galveston, USS Texas in Houston. We're their first destroyer. They had a destroyer escort. And they went to the Orlick in Lake Charles, us here in Baton Rouge, and I think now they're trying to branch out to the Batfish, a submarine up in Muskogee. And because they were coming all the way from Texas, our Louisiana groups are like, hey, we want to play too. And they've started coming out and doing Army. We had some do 1812 Navy in our gun deck exhibit on the second floor of the museum. One young man came in this last time in 2019. We had to skip it for 2020. And he was with a cavalry unit, World War II cavalry unit, and everybody's walking in with their machine guns and their bazookas and everything and their backpacks. And he walks in with a saddle and a bridle. I'm like, what are you doing? He said, well, our unit started out as a horse cavalry unit in World War II and very quickly transitioned over to mechanized cavalry. They said, so I'm representing the early part of the unit. All these guys, they're cowards. They don't want to mess with horses, so they're doing the regular mechanized stuff. But I'm doing the original roots of the unit. All sorts of interesting stuff. We have a program just like this for the library called Kidd Keynotes. It's an informational lecture series. We have topics on everything from destroyers at Normandy for D-Day to African American History Month to Asian Pacific and Asian American and Pacific Islanders Month, which is May right now, to PTSD dogs and their value. We go all over the place with it as far as how it relates to veterans. That lower right-hand picture, the little short gentleman beside me in the white shirt and hat, He was a citizen of North Vietnam. His brother went to a protest and he picked him up in his car. And because he was at that protest, the North Vietnamese army arrested him and threw him and his brother in jail for 2 years. And when he got out, he got his family together and he immigrated to South Vietnam. And he immediately joined the army. And he said, I knew that the North would be coming because if they're doing that to their own citizens, they're going to do it to others. And he fought in the South Vietnamese army against the North all the way up to the fall of Saigon. And as Saigon is falling, he loads his family up in a boat and he sails east. And he said, I knew the Americans would be out there somewhere. And sure enough, he got picked up by a destroyer similar to the Kidd and brought to Guam and then immigrated into the U.S., becoming U.S. citizens. And he told his story at Kidd Keynotes, and it is one of the most moving stories I've ever heard because I have never actually met a person. I've read about him through the American Revolution and other historical instances, but he has actually fought for his freedom. He had his freedom taken away, and he was fighting to keep it. And then eventually came over here. He said he loves America just because he had no home, and America took him in. You meet all sorts of great people at the USS Kidd. We do Twilight tours. Twilight tours are an adults-only rated R tour. Now, when I say rated R tour, I see them laughing over here. It's not like that. We got the idea from the USS New Jersey. You'll notice that ship people steal ideas from other ship people. And I steal ideas from art museums and so forth and so on. And basically, I'm a thief. But a good friend of mine, Jason, who was the curator for a long time at the Battleship New Jersey, came up with adults-only tours. And what the adults-only tour was they had a lot of racy sailor and marine art all through the battleship. And I say they had. It's still there. Jason came up with the idea of giving the tour, and people pay a little bit more to see it because they get a little bit of an adult beverage, and it's after hours, and they don't have to deal with the rest of the general public on a regular tour. It's kind of exclusive. And he puts, at this conference that we're at, he puts up a picture of some of this artwork, and it's like the pinup art, you know, it's a racy little thing from World War II. And the way the conference was set up, you had two seminars running concurrently. And that poor schmuck with the other seminar didn't have a single soul in his seminar. Everybody saw the racy art and they ran for the adults only tour. And there was nothing racy about any of the artwork. It was kind of crude, but he talked about the adults only tour. Our director at the time said, you need to do that for Kidd. And I said, I've got the Roadrunner. That's all I got. My guys didn't draw. We got the Pirates thing and we got the Roadrunner. I got nothing that'll draw people in. She said, find something. So what we came up with is the dangers of living aboard ship. Not just kamikazes hitting the ship, but passing mail. If we're passing mail with the line gun, we actually harpooned a guy. We accidentally fired depth charges in front of our own aircraft carriers. And it's not just limited to Kidd, it's other destroyers as well. One particular destroyer, and I'm hanging this out as bait for all of you out there if you want to get this story. There was a Fletcher-class destroyer that was involved in what was perceived as a presidential assassination attempt. And I'm going to leave it right there. Come see me. So Twilight tours is another way that we generate income to buy the paint, to take care of the ship. You can have a wedding on board the USS Kidd. You can have a wine tasting in the museum. You can have banquets, dinner parties, dances, launch parties. I was really surprised by the launch party that we did. And fashion shows. I've only done one fashion show, but it was really interesting. Now, another way, and this one's coming up on June 3rd, that you can help the Kidd. Tickets are still available for our annual fundraiser. Bob, you ready? Roaring on the River. Roaring on the River. It's a 1940s themed party, gala, whatever you want to call it. We'll describe it any way you want, as long as you buy a ticket and come. But you come down to the museum, there's drinks, you tour the ship. Mr. Bob will have all the information for you after we're finished here. But it's a good time. The first one we had was in 2019, and we had to shut it down for 2020, but we're bringing it back next month. You go to usskid.com, and you can get your tickets to come see Roaring on the River. Now, some of the programs that we do, this one does not generate income, but this is part of our veterans support mission. And this is Strong Warrior Yoga, Calm Warrior Yoga. And when this got introduced in 2015, Mr. Bob was there, some of our board members, some of the old guard were like, yoga in a museum? What kind of hippy dippy stuff is that? And I kept my mouth shut, but I was kind of like, yoga in a museum? Really? I went to the first couple of sessions, and there's this young lady, Claudia, and she was helping the yoga instructor kind of teach people how to start doing yoga. And Claudia served in the military. She was in Iraq. She was in the army. She could kick butt. And I asked her, I was like, what's the deal with yoga? And she said, Tim, yoga saved my life. Yoga is awesome because it's low impact exercise. She said, we get in the military, we go through boot camp, and we bust ourselves up. Sore muscles, achy joints, broken toes or fingers. She said, we get into our jobs and we're doing our jobs in the military and we bust ourselves up. We get injured. And we still have to keep going. And we get out. And all of a sudden, we're not doing that anymore. And we start stiffening up. And what do? First instinct, I got to exercise again. And you start doing exercise, play flag football, you go running, you go biking, you do all this stuff, and it's high impact, and you bust yourselves up. She said, yoga is low impact, it stretches, and you regain your flexibility without doing further damage. She said, yoga is awesome. Not only is yoga awesome for rebuilding your flexibility and your strength, but experts have proven that it helps with PTSD because it gives guys and girls who are suffering from PTSD coping mechanisms to calm themselves to where they can control it. So we actually have Yoga with Brandy has come out, and we haven't been able to do it since the pandemic. We did a couple of filmed events during COVID, but we're looking forward to everything lifting, all the restrictions and everything, and being able to get back into a situation where we can do yoga again. Something similar we've been trying to kick off for a while, but we need a sponsor. Is a peer support pilot program where we have people come in and they paint what they feel. Now, this is sneaky because it's not about the artwork. They're painting what they're feeling, but you've got everybody in the room is veterans. It's nobody from the outside like me who didn't serve. It would be people like Nate who served and people like Mr. Bob and Ed who served. And they're painting. They got 30 minutes, paint what you feel. Break for cookies and punch. They get together in a circle afterwards and they talk about what made them paint this. What does this represent? And what it's doing, they're in a safe environment with other people who understand what they've been through. And no one is judging. Nobody's an art critic. Nobody's going to go, man, your artwork sucks. Nobody does that. They sit there and they listen. And what ends up happening, one guy, let's say Ed, Ed may suffer from night frights, right? He just wakes up and he's back in action. Guns blazing, bombs going off. And yet what he finds out is Bob also suffers from night frights. And Bob gets together with him later and says, dude, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've been there. I've done that. This has worked for me. Dude, if you need help, here's my number. They're getting peer support. They're finding out that they're not alone. One of the biggest problems with veteran suicide, and they talk about 22 a day. 22 a day is not even close. It's higher. But veteran suicide, the biggest thing, common theme, is they feel like they're alone. They feel like there's no escape. There's nothing that they can do except get out. And by finding out that they're not alone, that keeps them around a little bit longer to be able to learn how to cope. And so that's what the art actually is about, is to get them talking to each other and find somebody who has a common situation. We bring in traveling and temporary exhibits to the museum. We had an art exhibit. Can you believe it? An art exhibit at a military museum called Captured in Canvas. The USS Kidd is interpreted through brush and lens. Very well received. I was really shocked because this was going out on a limb, and I'm reaching out to local artists and photographers, and I said, "Would you? I love this painting, this photograph that you've done. Would you consider, letting us include it in the exhibition?" And every single, I only had two of them tell me, no. But every single one of them were like, "This is awesome. We would love to display." My favorite is the top one with all the grass. It looks like kids sailing through a prairie. That's an example of what it looks like when the river goes down and she's high and dry in her cradle. Guardians of Sunda Strait, the USS Houston and HMAS Perth was here a few years ago from the Australian National Maritime Museum. If you haven't been to the Kidd in a while, we built a World War I anniversary exhibit, complete with a World War I trench. The signposts, actually, if you take all those directions from those cities, the kids, even you, kids, adults at heart, kids at heart, adults, you could take and use a map and find out where that trench is supposed to be located. We had Marking Time, Voyage to Vietnam. One of the ships that was used in the movie The Thin Red Line was a troop ship that was used in World War II, Korea, and they pulled it out of mothballs in Vietnam, and they started shipping guys over. I think it was a 60-day voyage to Vietnam from San Francisco. And they're not part of the ship's crew. They're Army guys, they're Marines. So they're going to eat, they're going to the bathroom, and they're going and sitting in their bunk, and they're bored stiff, and they're wondering what's going to be waiting for me. And they started doing graffiti art on the bottoms of the bunk above them. And this exhibit brought that artwork to Baton Rouge and let us show it. We were the last stop before they finally decommissioned the exhibit and broke it up and sent it to different museums. We actually have one from one canvas that they left with us. A gentleman from Baton Rouge actually had his name on it. Invasion Yanqui was about the Mexican War. Images of Valor was about Latinos and Latinas in World War II. Both of those were here in 2018. I loved this one. Nate, did you see this one? You did. Snoopy and the Red Baron. It was so much fun. And we had a little dog house that the kids could pose next to, and they had their flight caps and their goggles and their scarf, and they dressed up like Snoopy and posed with a Snoopy and everything. And it's interesting looking at the exhibit to see how the artist actually tied language into it, tied sociology into it, tied technology into it. Cartoonists are sneaky. And the one that we just finished up with last month, War and Peace in the Pacific, the home front. This was also from the Australian National Maritime Museum. This was put together by high school students in the US, Japan, and Australia. They researched their specific areas. They put together the banners for their part of the exhibit, and they all got together and went on trips to Australia, to Japan, and this particular one, they did it for 4 years in a row. I think for this last year, they went to New Orleans to the World War II Museum. Great exhibit, though. Over the years, we have had port visits by historic and military ships, and whenever you bring a ship and park it next to the USS Kidd, Baton Rouge, and Alexandria, and Lafayette, and New Orleans, people pour into the city to go see those old replicas. The last one we had was a replica of the Santa Maria from Columbus's voyage. The one before that, which is the big one right in the middle there, is El Galeon Andalucia. She's a replica of the big Spanish galleons that helped settle the New World. Now, this is really cool. We have family passes now at the Livingston Parish Library, and we're working with the East Baton Rouge Parish Library. If you have a library pass, you can come in and you can check out the passes, and you can go visit the USS Kidd for free. And then you bring it back and you check it back into the library, and somebody else comes and checks it out, and they go visit the USS Kidd for free. And correct me if I'm wrong, but library cards are free, right? Library cards are free. If you do not have a family pass to the system, to the USS Kidd in your library system, talk to the people at the library, let them know. Now, COVID threw a curveball. Am I running over? Am I okay? I'm good? Okay. COVID threw a curveball to the museums industry. And that curveball was this. March, April, and May is when we've all been kids, right? Yeah. I was a kid. You're a kid. You're a kid? Ed's still a kid. So March, April, and May is when field trips happen. You get to leave the classroom. You get to go somewhere cool, right? And usually you're going to a museum or you're going to a historic site or something, a science museum, something. And that's where they come to us. And that amounts to museums' version of Black Friday for the retail. Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, that's when all the retail businesses make all their money for the year, and then that helps them get through the rest of the year when things drop back down. Even the Christmas season isn't as big as Black Friday. Museums, no other time in the year is as big as March, April, May. When did the lockdown occur? March, April, May. That's when it first started. All the schools or all the kids are at home, everything is shut down. And that sucker punched museums everywhere. American Alliance of Museums, who I was talking about earlier, who called us leeches. American Alliance of Museums predicted and still predicts that 1/3 of American museums will not survive the pandemic because we're all nonprofit. And most of us don't have huge endowments like the Smithsonian or the Met in New York or the World War II Museum in New Orleans. Most of us ride that thin line between red and black very closely. So something like this that shuts you down for months. And I can tell you right now, USS Intrepid in New York and USS Midway in San Diego and USS Iowa in Los Angeles just opened up within the past 3 weeks. They've been shut down because New York and California were the hardest hit with restrictions. So we all had to figure out how do we engage our people when our people can't come to us. And one of the things we did, at least one of the things the kid did, is working through our social media, through Facebook, through Instagram, through Twitter. And we started educating in ways that are not normal for social media. On the one on the left here, we're talking about art and we're talking about literature for World War I. For the one on the right, we're talking about sonar and how sonar contributed to Earth science by finally taking the theory of continental drift as late as 1951. That was still a theory in 1951. Continental drift, for me, has been a reality from day one. I was born in 1970. But continental drift was not confirmed until 1951 when they got sonar, like the one pictured there on board the Kidd, and they started mapping the ocean floor. And they found these ridges and they found these mountains. And it's like, well, why would you have these deep trenches? And then they realized the continental plates were moving, and that's what formed everything. And the theory was confirmed. That's a map for the Mississippi Delta, but if you're not familiar with that on the left, if you're not familiar with what it looks like from a satellite view, you can take the GPS coordinates there, or not the GPS coordinates, but the longitude and latitude, and you can use your map to figure out where in the world that image comes from. So we challenged some of our kids to do that online. We talked about International Dog Day because that little chap sitting right there on the Kidd on our anchor windlass is Scotty, and Scotty was one of our 2 mascot dogs in World War II. And you notice the shark over on the right. Submarines in World War II were named after creatures of the sea. So we kind of jumped in on the coattails of the Discovery Channel's Shark Week. And all week long for Shark Week, we talked about the submarines that were named for different types of sharks. And brother, let me tell you, there's a lot of sharks. Submarines named for sharks. And we had about 2 or 3 posts going a day just to keep up and get all of those shark names squeezed in. So how do we do what we do? We do it with a very, very small staff If you're here in person, you're looking at our ship's staff on board, our restoration crew with Nathan Berger on there. And every once in a while, I get to paint and sand. Uh, so that's it. So we have volunteers that come in and help us. We have Eagle Scout and Girl Scout projects. We have a weekly maintenance group of volunteers that comes in. We did have a lot of veterans that were coming in, and unfortunately, they were in the demographic that's most vulnerable to COVID. So they disappeared for the past year for the most part. A few of them have been down a few times since then. But the folks that really, really saved the day were a group of missionaries from the Church of the Latter-day Saints. And they've been coming down since last June religiously, no pun intended, actually, yeah, pun intended, every Friday for 2 hours. And they have helped us improve kids' appearance so much. We have many field days, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. Our fall field day every last weekend of October brings veterans in from around the country, and they spend the weekend living on board the ship with skilled labor, people like Nathan who can do the rope work, they can do the metal work, they can do electrical, they can do plumbing, and they help us keep the ship up. We have museum field days where people can come in and clean the museum and help us move exhibits around. And we can specially design, if you have a group, we can specially design a volunteer day for you. You just have to call up and let us know that you're interested. This is the mini field days. We started the mini field days hoping one Saturday a month, and Ed was one of our first attendees, hoping that we would get locals that would come in one Saturday every other month, and it would kind of be like a farm league, like baseball. You got the minor leagues, and then they move from the minor leagues up to the major leagues. We're hoping we could get a regular mini field day attendance and then transition them into the weekly volunteer crew. And that just didn't pan out. But what we did right before COVID hit, we adapted it. And we've got a monthly housekeeping field day program going on. And we've had these folks here are from the Sigma Chi fraternity at LSU. And they have to go out and do community service and get so many hours. And so twice a year they've come in, they've adopted the month of October and usually the month of March, but another fraternity beat them to the punch for this past March, so they had to shift to April. They were a little piqued by that. Arnold Air Society has done it. The Latter-day Saints have taken one of the months. If you have a group, Ed's group with the Star Trek, USS Corsair Star Trek fan club, picked August of, was it August of 2020? Yeah, August of 2020. In the middle of the pandemic, they came out and cleaned the ship. So, our main theme, we're about education, we're about veteran support. We're also about the restoration and preservation of the USS Kidd and the two aircraft we have down there, the P-40 and the A-7. In the past 38 years, we have added over 90 tons of equipment back to the USS Kidd. That's a lot of steel. Nate has done most of it. To get her back to her World War II configuration. At present, she is the only destroyer in the world that is in her World War II configuration. As I said earlier, the others got modified. They can't walk it back to World War II. They were built in World War II. They are World War II destroyers, but their configuration is more Cold War. She is recognized as one of the ships that sets the gold standard for the historic fleet. That's 188 ships located across 13 continents. I'm sorry, 13 continents? I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not an earth science major. 13 nations in 5 continents. Some of the projects that we've been working on the past few years, we've had Eagle Scouts paint our 5-inch projectiles, which you can see there with the red and yellow tips and the blue and the green. We have gotten ammo hoist viewing ports to where people walk up and they see this big piece of equipment in an ammo handling room and they're like, what's that? And they had no clue. And one of the things we try not to do is just bombard Kidd with signage. We want it to look like she did when the sailors were on board in World War II. And a gentleman in Baltimore came up with this wonderful viewing port, and that's right below the 5-inch projectile picture. And I hate plexiglass. It looks like you're in a laboratory, but he did it in such a small intrusion with that cap on the hoist. We put a projectile in there, we put the cap on, cinch it down, and people walk up and they go, oh, this is where the bullets came up. Genius, genius. I wish I had thought of it. We have gotten 1,200 brass casings from the U.S. Air Force. We were lucky we had the right person in the right spot at the right time with the right relative in the right job in the Air Force. And we asked the question and it moved through the Air Force and they called up and they said, you want some projectiles? There's only 2 units left in the U.S. military that actually use these guns anymore. They're all obsolete, but they stuck them in the back of AC-130 gunships and they're still using them. And they're all stamped World War II dates. 1943 through 45. This is a project that's very close to Nathan's heart right now. You see where the metal is rusted away from the deck on the bulkheads. And that is because of 2 reasons. In the 1960s, they poured cement leveler in some of the rooms in the deck houses to level it out so they could lay tile. I don't know why. But the cement is acidic, traps the water down there, and it rusts out the metal. The other problem is they riveted aluminum to steel. There's no barrier, and so it steals electrons and it rusts away. So right now what Nathan is doing is he's cutting out all that bad steel. He's welding in new steel. He's putting a Teflon sheath between the 2 different types of metals. He's taking and putting the holes through for rivets, and then he's taking the steel rivet, putting a Teflon washer on the head, and putting a Teflon sheath around the shaft, and he's tying them back together. And hopefully it'll be 60 or 70 years after Nate and I will be gone before somebody will have to do this again, instead of just 40 or 50 years. It'll last a little longer. You can see some of that cement there. Putting a historic ship together is like a big jigsaw puzzle, I've heard it said. And our last big puzzle piece came in 2018. And you see they have fabricated and lifted a blast shield on top of the torpedo tubes. That blast shield protected the 2 guys that sat in there from the muzzle blast of a 5-inch gun right behind them. And it's a big metal drum, and I kind of wondered if it really did protect them too much, but that's what was supposed to be there, and that was the last major piece. If you're standing on the levee looking at the Kidd, that was the last thing that was missing from her silhouette, from her image from 1945. And a very nice gentleman, you can see him in the bottom left of the biggest picture, Greg Shears. His son is in the top right of that picture in the yellow vest, Tracy. Greg took that project to heart, and he and James Landry, who I mentioned earlier, he's got the yellow heart hat on, they funded that. And Greg went around to some businesses in Phoenix, Arizona, and showed them the plans and the photographs we had from the only 2 shields, original shields, still in existence. And they fabricated it at cost, and they shipped it over here to Baton Rouge. And McKinney Salvage and Heavy Lift here in Baton Rouge, longtime friend of the USS Kidd, humongous supporter. Can't say enough nice things about them. They brought a crane barge out and they lifted that sucker up on top of the torpedo tubes for us free of charge. So what's next? Our strategic plan, our mission says we're about education, preservation, and veteran support. Well, if you don't grow, that which does not grow dies. You can't be the same thing forever. You've got to make it new. You've got to make it fresh for your audience. Otherwise, people just stop coming. So what do we want to be when we grow up? Can our current facility support our vision? One of the things we've got to do is we've got to drum up local support. And we ran into this about 6 years ago. For the longest time, the people who were fundraising for the museum focused exclusively on World War II Navy vets. That was it. That was their bread and butter. And what happened to the World War II Navy vets? Most of them are gone. They're aged out. There's very few of them still around. So you can't run a museum on people who live on limited income or people who aren't there anymore. So our fundraising has to expand more beyond just vets. It's got to get in the community, because if the Baton Rouge community is not interested in the USS Kidd, will the USS Kidd still be here? The answer is no. We're seeing ships shift between cities now in the historic fleet, looking for new homes, looking for new places to berth, and we don't want that to be the Kidd. The Kidd, the museum, is your museum, and we want you to be invested. So we're finding our audience. Our next big project on the horizon, dry docking. The Department of the Interior says that historic vessels should have schedules for regular maintenance, including dry docking. Dry docking means pulling her out of the water and doing hull work and making sure that 3/8 of an inch skin is still in good shape, still 3/8 of an inch. A ship in saltwater, you need it dry docked about every 5 to 10 years. Ship in freshwater can go as many as 10 to 20. The last known dry docking for the USS Kidd, are you ready? Are you ready? Here we go. 1962, 59 years ago. It's a little bit more than 10 to 20 years. She has been in Baton Rouge in the Mississippi's freshwater for 38 years. So it's past time. So why dry dock her? Aren't we taking care of her? And the answer is yes, we are taking care of her day in and day out. That man sitting right back there, if I didn't tell him to go home and take a Nate day, he would be on her 7 days a week, 24 hours a stinking day. And I would be in trouble. Kid turned 78 on April 23rd. People look at dry docking. When we first talked about this last year, some people lost their minds. Oh my God, the kid's leaving. Kid's not leaving Baton Rouge. She might go for a doctor's visit, a doctor's appointment. And that's the best way I can describe a dry docking. Your 78-year-old grandma is going to the doctor how many times? I'm going to call somebody out. Mr. Bob, how often do you go to the doctor? 4 times a year. He goes to the doctor 4 times a year, not 4 every 59 years. 4 times a year. So kid would need to go to dry dock and then not need to go again for 10 to 20 years, hopefully, knock on wood. So dry docking is not that big a deal. The ship will not be leaving. Every ship, it's a health check. Every ship in the historic fleet goes to dry dock if they want to survive. And we are lucky because we're in freshwater and our cradle system lets us get high and dry periodically throughout the year. So we're not immersed all the time, and we're definitely not in salt water, which is massively corrosive. So this is just a list of ships all around the country and the dates that they've been to dry dock. 2010 for the Cass and Young. Laffey, which is pictured here, 2009. And it had been forever since Laffey had been pulled out, and you can see the damage the salt water did. They actually had to peel skin off of her and replace it. We don't want to be there. So that is the history of the 3 USS Kidds and the little bit of information and history of the museum and our programming and our goals. And I hope you've enjoyed it, because blah, 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 that's all, folks. Thank you. Yes, sir. The P-40. The P-40 has a varied history. That is not actually the same plane that was there when the museum first opened up in 1980. The museum building first opened up in 1986. What you saw in 1986 was the cockpit and the 2 wings of a P-40 that was salvaged from New Guinea by a gentleman who he was a warbird enthusiast, and he ran a restaurant chain all up and down the West Coast, mostly in California from what I understand. And his theme for his restaurants was mounting a warbird in some way, shape, or form outside. So if you were driving down the highway, you saw a warbird, you knew that was his restaurant. He never finished getting pieces and parts for it, and he had this is everything I've been able to research on it. He had a B-29. It was one of the first B-29s that got restored, and they were trying to get permission to fly it, and the Japanese government was adamant they did not want that bird flying. And he worked with our founding father, Congressman Henson Moore, to get with the FAA and get permission to fly it again. And so through that connection with Congressman Moore, the pieces for that P-40 were donated to LSU. And they were going to do a Chenault Museum at LSU at some point, and it sat underneath Tiger Stadium. You'll hear a lot of Tigers go, "I remember that plane was under the stadium." You know, it's like an urban legend. You know, wasn't there a plane? I can't see it anymore. What'd they do with it? And Congressman Moore was our founding father, and this all occurred before the Kidd project started. And once the Kidd got to town and they started building the museum, Congressman Moore started talking to LSU, and they hadn't done anything with it, and so they donated it to the museum. And Brian Harris Chevrolet donated one of their sheet metal guys in the shop, donated his time. They just said, don't come to work, go down to the Kidd. And he helped put together the missing pieces of that P-40. And when they pulled it apart in 97, it looked like spit, Bondo, chicken wire, baling and string, and 2x4s. But what happened in 97, a gentleman by the name of John Fallis, who was also a warbird enthusiast, took a look at it, realized what it was, and he was trying to build a P-40 that would actually fly. And he made a deal with the museum, and we talked to the Naval Aviation Museum at Pensacola. We talked to the Air Force Museum to see what they thought about it. And the deal was he would get us a fiberglass aluminum replica, like what they use in some museums and what they use in the movie industry. He would paint it however we wanted it painted. He would transport it and install it for us. He wanted the two wings in the cockpit. And since that was the only original parts, those two museums, those two experts in aviation restoration, basically said, you're nuts if you don't take this deal. And we traded that out, and we included into the deal that he had to fly the P-40, the working P-40, once he got it built, for our 4th of July celebration every year. And he did so for many, many years. His health has deteriorated now. Unfortunately, he can't do it anymore. But that's how Joy, the current Joy, she's nicknamed Joy, is at the museum. Yes, sir. Any other questions?
We don't have any questions from Facebook, but
Okay.
Wayne Barker does say thank you for this presentation.
Oh, thank you, Lane. Appreciate you watching. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate it. Come see us at the Kidd.